Summer 2003. A group of hikers trekked deep into an overgrown forest in Eastern Europe. The air is damp-heavy, with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. Then, someone notices it, a jagged sliver of rusted metal poking through the undergrowth. They clear away the vines and realize they're looking at the skeletal remains of a World War II fighter plane untouched for decades. And inside the cockpit, still strapped in his seat, is the pilot who vanished without a trace in 1943. Before we dive into this incredible mystery, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that the world almost forgot. Introduction. This is the story of Captain Danny Harrington, a young American fighter pilot who disappeared during a combat mission in World War II. For 60 years, no one knew where his plane had gone down or what had happened in those final moments. What began as a routine escort mission turned into one of the most haunting aviation mysteries of the war, until an extraordinary discovery finally brought answers, and with them, even more questions. A young pilot with a dream. Born in 1919 in Springfield, Illinois, Danny Harrington was the kind of young man people remembered. He was tall, charismatic, with an easy smile and a confidence that came from growing up during the Great Depression and learning to fend for himself. By the time the United States entered WWII, Danny had already logged hundreds of flight hours as a civilian pilot. When he enlisted in the Army Air Forces, it wasn't long before he was assigned to fly one of the most advanced aircraft of the time, the P-51 Mustang. In letters to his sister, Danny wrote about the feeling of flying. "When I'm in the cockpit, I feel untouchable, like the sky belongs to me." The mission. July 1943. In the summer of 1943, Danny's squadron was stationed in England tasked with escorting Allied bombers on long-range missions over German-occupied Europe. On July 14th, the orders were straightforward: protect a formation of B-17 bombers on a run over industrial targets in Poland. The mission was dangerous. Enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire were a constant threat, but Danny had flown dozens like it before. That morning, he climbed into his P-51, checked his instruments, and gave a casual wave to his squadron mate, Lieutenant Mark Callahan. Neither man knew it would be the last time they'd see each other. The last radio message. The squadron rendezvoused with the bombers high over the North Sea and pushed deep into enemy territory. For the first 2 hours, the mission went as planned. Then somewhere over eastern Poland, the radio crackled with urgency. It was Danny's voice. "Taking fire. Engines hit. Losing oil pressure. I'll try to make it back." Seconds later, another pilot reported seeing Danny's Mustang trailing smoke descending rapidly but under control. He was heading east, away from the main group. That was the last anyone heard from Captain Harrington. Searching for a ghost. After the mission, search and rescue crews scoured the region. Reconnaissance flights looked for crash sites, but wartime chaos made it nearly impossible to search thoroughly behind enemy lines. No wreckage, no parachute sighting, no prisoner of war records. It was as if Danny Harrington and his Mustang had simply evaporated. His family received the dreaded telegram, "Missing in action." For years afterward, his sister kept writing letters to military offices, hoping for updates. None ever came. A mystery buried in time. Over the decades, Harrington's disappearance faded into the background of WWII's countless tragedies. Veterans who had flown with him grew old and passed away. His hometown erected a small memorial plaque in his honor, but no one expected the mystery to ever be solved. That is until a fateful summer day in 2003 when nature and a twist of chance finally revealed the truth. The discovery. On July 19, 2003, three hikers exploring a remote forest in eastern Poland stumbled upon something strange. Half buried under decades of soil and moss was the twisted outline of a metal fuselage. The shape was unmistakable, the remains of a WWII aircraft. The plane's aluminum skin was mottled with rust bullet holes, still visible along the wings. The propeller was bent backward from impact. As they cleared more debris, the hikers froze. The canopy was still closed. Inside, strapped in with frayed leather harnesses, sat the skeletal remains of the pilot helmet on goggles in place, as if waiting for orders that never came. On the tattered fabric of his flight jacket was a name patch, Harrington. The investigation begins. Local authorities were the first to respond to the hikers' call. Within hours, Polish military historians and aviation experts arrived at the site. They knew immediately this wasn't just any crash. The plane was remarkably well-preserved, shielded for decades by the thick forest canopy. The first task was to confirm the aircraft's identity. Stenciled under the grime on the fuselage was the faded marking USAAF, United States Army Air Forces, and a partial serial number. Cross-checking wartime records, they matched it to a P-51 Mustang, flown by Captain Danny Harrington, reported missing on July 14, 1943. After 60 years, the lost Mustang had been found. The pilot's final moments. When forensic teams carefully removed Harrington's remains from the cockpit, they noticed something unusual. There were no major skeletal fractures typically seen in high-speed crashes. Instead, his injuries were consistent with a controlled crash landing. The Mustang's landing gear had been up, and the surrounding trees were snapped, not splintered, suggesting he'd glided in low before impact. Inside the cockpit, and they found his sidearm still holstered, his survival knife tucked it into his boot, and a small canvas pouch containing a compass and a folded map marked with a potential escape route westward. It looked as though Captain Harrington had been prepared to survive. A disturbing clue. But there was something else. Near the seat, wedged between a console panel and the fuselage frame, was a spent .45 caliber shell casing the same type used in Harrington's issued pistol. Had he fired it in the self-defense against whom there were no signs of German forces ever reporting the downed Mustang and no bullet holes in the fuselage from small arms fire after the crash? It was a question investigators couldn't answer, not yet. Personal items. Among the wreckage were several personal effects. In the breast pocket of his jacket, they found a metal cigarette case with 2 unlit cigarettes still inside a corroded lighter engraved with his initials DHH, and a photo of a smiling young woman holding a puppy later confirmed to be his fiancée, Margaret Maggie Lane, back home in Illinois. Perhaps the most haunting item was a folded letter sealed in a plastic sleeve, addressed simply, "To whoever finds me." The letter. The paper was brittle. The ink faded but legible. If you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I was forced down behind enemy lines after engine trouble. I will try to reach the Allied front on foot. Tell my family I thought of them to the end. Danny Harrington. There was no date on the letter. That left open the possibility that Harrington had left the crash site and that the skeletal remains found in the cockpit weren't left there immediately after the landing. Forest evidence. A few meters from the crash, archaeologists uncovered remnants of a makeshift campfire charcoal and partially burned twigs buried under layers of forest debris. Radiocarbon dating suggested the fire had been lit sometime in the 1940s. Who had built it? If it was Harrington, why return to the cockpit? Had he been hiding from patrols, waiting for rescue that never came? Military archives. Back in the United States, researchers dug deeper into military archives. Declassified intelligence reports from 1943 mentioned an unidentified Allied aircraft sighted by German units in the region, but no capture report followed. One intriguing detail emerged that same week. Local resistance fighters had helped smuggle an unnamed Allied airman toward the Slovak border. No one could confirm if it was Harrington, but the timing was suspiciously close. Mystery deepens. By the end of the investigation's first phase, experts had more questions than answers. Harrington's Mustang had come down intact enough for him to survive. He had supplies, a weapon, and a plan. Yet somehow his story ended in that cockpit, alone, entombed in silence for 6 decades. What happened in the days between his crash landing and his death remains one of the great unsolved footnotes of WWII aviation history. The world in 1943. In the summer of 1943, eastern Poland was a dangerous and volatile place. German forces controlled the town's railways and main roads. Patrols swept through villages, daily hunting for partisans and anyone aiding the Allies. Beyond the constant threat of capture, the forests were home to their own dangers: wolves, scarcity of food, and the bitter reality that a lone man could vanish without anyone noticing. If Captain Harrington had made it out of his Mustang alive, his survival would have depended on staying invisible and finding people willing to risk their lives to help him. The resistance networks. Poland's underground resistance, the Armia Krajowa Home Army, operated in small secretive cells. Their members smuggled information, sabotaged supply lines, and when possible, rescued downed Allied airmen. Historians later confirmed that in July 1943, resistance couriers were moving captured intelligence from the Eastern Front to Allied contacts. The route passed within 30 miles of where Harrington's Mustang was found. Possible contact. A surviving resistance veteran interviewed decades later recalled helping an American flyer who spoke little Polish. The man had a wounded leg and carried a small pistol. The veteran said they provided him food and pointed him west toward friendly territory, but the man never reached his destination. Could this have been Harrington? The description matched him perfectly, down to the limp caused by the injury investigators found evidence of in his remains. The perils of escape. Escaping from enemy territory wasn't as simple as walking west. German checkpoints lined the main roads, and anyone without proper papers could be detained or executed on the spot. Many captured airmen were sent to prisoner of war camps, but those caught with weapons, especially in areas plagued by partisan activity, faced immediate execution. If Harrington was moving through this hostile landscape, every hour would have been a gamble with death. The trail goes cold. Military records after July 1943 are silent about any recovered American pilot in that region. German unit logs do show increased security activity near the forest where the Mustang was found, patrol sweeps, arrests, and reports of foreign agents moving through the area. But there's no direct mention of Harrington. If he had been captured, the records may have been lost or deliberately destroyed. The unanswered questions. So why did his remains end up back in the cockpit? One theory suggests that Harrington injured and possibly hunted, returned to his aircraft to retrieve supplies and was either too weak to leave again or deliberately hid inside, hoping to avoid detection. Another theory is darker, that German troops found the wreck and placed his body back in the cockpit to stage the scene, concealing the fact that he'd been executed elsewhere. Fragments of truth. What is certain is that Harrington's crash site became a time capsule. The sealed canopy, the forest's isolation, and decades without disturbance preserved a moment in history almost exactly as it had been in 1943. His story remained suspended in that silent grove until the hikers stumbled across it, reigniting a mystery that may never be fully solved. The journey back. Once the investigation in Poland concluded, arrangements were made to return Captain Harrington's remains to the United States. The U.S. Defense WWII accounting agency, working alongside Polish officials, prepared his bones for repatriation. On a rainy afternoon in September 2003, a flag-draped casket was carried aboard a military transport plane at Warsaw Chopin Airport. For the first time in 60 years, Danny Harrington was going home. A hometown waiting in Springfield, Illinois, the news had spread quickly. Local veterans groups, school children, and townspeople lined the streets leading from the airport to the funeral home. Many carried small American flags. For older residents, the name Danny Harrington was more than just a local hero. It was a wound that had never healed. The family's reaction. Margaret Maggie Lane. Harrington's wartime fiancée had married someone else after the war, but she was still alive at 82. When she heard the news, she wept openly. "I always believed he was out there somewhere," she told reporters. "Now I know where he's been all this time." Harrington's younger sister Ruth, now in her 70s, stood by the casket at the viewing. She whispered something private and placed a small silver cross, the same one Danny had given her, before shipping out inside. The funeral. The funeral took place with full military honors. An honor guard in crisp uniforms stood at attention rifles at their side. The sound of a bugler playing taps echoed through the cemetery. 3 volleys of rifle fire cracked the air. A folded flag was presented to Ruth with the words, "On behalf of a grateful nation." For those present, the ceremony was not just for Harrington, but for every soldier whose fate remains unknown. A surprising connection. During the months following his return, historians uncovered something remarkable. Another downed Allied pilot, a British Spitfire ace named Peter Wallace, had crashed in Yugoslavia in 1943. Wallace's journal, recovered years later, mentioned meeting an American Mustang pilot named Danny while hiding with partisans. If this was true, Harrington had not only survived his crash, but had traveled hundreds of miles south before disappearing again. The dates and locations were close enough to make historians wonder, had Harrington's journey been far longer and more complex than anyone imagined, leaving behind a legacy? Whether the Wallace account was Harrington or another airman, his story became a symbol of perseverance and sacrifice. The wreck of his P-51 Mustang remains in Poland, preserved as a memorial to Allied pilots who never returned. Local school children now visit the site each year, learning the story of the American flyer in the forest. Unanswered questions. Even after Harrington's return home, the case remains riddled with uncertainties. Why were his remains found in the cockpit if evidence suggested he survived the crash? Did he truly cross paths with partisans, and possibly with British pilot Peter Wallace, in the months following his disappearance? And if so, what happened that led him back to the Mustang in that silent forest? Theories from historians. 1. The shelter theory. Some believe Harrington used the cockpit as a makeshift shelter while evading capture. Injured and exhausted, he may have died there from wounds or exposure. 2. The staged scene theory. Others suspect German forces found him alive, executed him, and placed his body back in the cockpit to conceal the killing. This would explain the spent shell casing and the absence of an official POW record. 3. The long journey. Theory. Supporters of the Wallace account think Harrington's body may have been returned to the crash site years later, possibly by locals who wanted to honor him in the place where his ordeal began. A time capsule in the woods. Whatever the truth, the P-51 Mustang in the forest became more than wreckage. It became a frozen moment in history, a reminder of the dangers faced by young men who left everything behind to fight a war far from home. The forest shielded Harrington's story for 6 decades until chance allowed it to surface. The man behind the legend. To his family. Danny Harrington wasn't just a name on a memorial or a set of military records. He was a son, a brother, a fiancé, a young man who loved flying jazz records and fishing in the summer. Bringing him home allowed them to close a chapter they'd been living with since 1943. The final word. In the words of Ruth Harrington during the funeral, Danny didn't die in that forest forgotten. He came home. And now, everyone knows his story. If this story moved you, please share it so others can remember Captain Harrington and the countless others still missing in action. Subscribe to our channel for more untold true stories that deserve to be heard. And remember, history doesn't always stay buried. Sometimes it waits quietly in the shadows until we're ready to find it.